Roman 7. Its supposed checks and balances. In a former essay, I devoted an elaborate discussion to the comparison of the royal and unroyal form of parliamentary government. I showed that at the formation of a ministry, and during the continuance of a ministry, a really sagacious monarch might be of rare use. I ascertained that it was a mistake to fancy that at such times a constitutional monarch had no rule and no duties. But I proved likewise that the temper, the disposition, and the faculties then needful to fit a constitutional monarch for usefulness were very rare, at least as rare as the faculties of a great absolute monarch, and that a common man in that place is apt to do at least as much harm as good, perhaps more harm. But in that essay, I could not discuss fully the functions of a king at the conclusion of an administration. For then the most peculiar parts of the English government, the power to dissolve the House of Commons, and the power to create new peers, come into play. And until the nature of the House of Lords and the nature of the House of Commons had been explained, I had no premises for an argument as to the characteristic action of the king upon them. We have since considered the functions of the two houses and also the effects of changes of ministry on our administrative system. We are now, therefore, in a position to discuss the functions of a king at the end of an administration. I may seem over-formal in this matter, but I am very formal on purpose. It appears to me that the functions of our executive in dissolving the commons and augmenting the peers are among the most important, and the least appreciated, parts of our whole government, and that hundreds of errors have been made in copying the English Constitution from not comprehending them. Hobbes told us long ago, and everybody now understands, that there must be a supreme authority, a conclusive power, in every state on every point somewhere. The idea of government involves it when that idea is properly understood. But there are two classes of governments. In one, the supreme determining power is upon all points the same. In the other, that ultimate power is different upon different points, now resides in one part of the Constitution and now in another. The Americans thought that they were imitating the English in making their Constitution upon the last principle in having one ultimate authority for one sort of matter and another for another sort. But in truth, the English Constitution is the type of the opposite species. It has only one authority for all sorts of matters. To gain a living conception of the difference, let us see what the Americans did. First, they altogether retained what in part they could not help, the sovereignty of the separate states. A fundamental article of the federal Constitution says that the powers not delegated to the central government are reserved to the states respectively. And the whole recent history of the Union, perhaps all its history, has been more determined by that enactment than by any other single cause. The sovereignty of the principal matters of state has rested not with the highest government, but with the subordinate government. The federal government could not touch slavery, the domestic institution, which divided the Union into two halves, unlike one another in morals, politics, and social condition, and at last set them to fight. This determining political fact was not in the jurisdiction of the highest government in the country, where you might expect its highest wisdom, nor in the central government, where you might look for impartiality, but in local governments, where petty interests were sure to be considered, and where only inferior abilities were likely to be employed. The capital fact was reserved for the minor jurisdictions. Again, there has been only one matter comparable to slavery in the United States, and that has been vitally affected by the state governments also. Their ultrademocracy is not a result of federal legislation, but of state legislation. The federal Constitution deputed one of the main items of its structure to the subordinate governments. One of its clauses provides that the suffrages for the federal House of Representatives shall be, in each state, the same as for the most numerous branch of the legislature of that state. And as each state fixes the suffrage for its own legislatures, the states altogether fix the suffrage for the federal lower chamber. By another clause of the federal Constitution, the states fix the electoral qualification for voting at a presidential election. The primary element in a free government, the determination how many people shall have a share in it in America, depends not on the government, but on certain subordinate local, and sometimes, as in the South now, hostile bodies. Doubtless the framers of the Constitution had not much choice in the matter. The wisest of them were anxious to get as much power for the central government and to leave as little to the local governments as they could. But a cry was got up that this wisdom would create a tyranny and impair freedom, and with that help, local jealousy triumphed easily. All federal government is, in truth, a case in which what I have called the dignified elements of government do not coincide with the serviceable elements. At the beginning of every league, the separate states are the old governments which attract and keep the love and loyalty of the people. The federal government is a useful thing, but new and unattractive. It must concede much to the state governments, for it is indebted to them for motive power. They are the governments which the people voluntarily obey. When the state governments are not thus loved, they vanish as the little Italian and the little German potentates vanished. No federation is needed. A single central government rules all. But the division of the sovereign authority in the American Constitution is far more complex than this. The part of that authority left to the federal government is itself divided and subdivided. The greatest instance is the most obvious. The Congress rules the law, but the President rules the administration. One means of unity the Constitution does give. The President can veto laws he does not like. But when 2/3 of both houses are unanimous, as has lately happened, they can overrule the President and make the laws without him. So here there are 3 separate repositories of the legislative power in different cases. First, Congress and the President when they agree. Next, the President when he effectually exerts his power. Then the requisite 2/3 of Congress when they overrule the President. And the President need not be overactive in carrying out a law he does not approve of. He may indeed be impeached for gross neglect, but between criminal nonfeasance and zealous activity, there are infinite degrees. Mr. Johnson does not carry out the Freedman's Bureau Bill as Mr. Lincoln, who approved of it, would have carried it out. The American Constitution has a special contrivance for varying the supreme legislative authority in different cases and dividing the administrative authority from it in all cases. But the administrative power itself is not left thus simple and undivided. One most important part of administration is international policy, and the supreme authority here is not in the President, still less in the House of Representatives, but in the Senate. The President can only make treaties, provided 2/3 of senators concur. The sovereignty, therefore, for the greatest international questions is in a different part of the state altogether from any common administrative or legislative question. It is put in a place by itself. Again, the Congress declares war, but they would find it very difficult, according to the recent construction of their laws, to compel the President to make a peace. The authors of the Constitution, doubtless, intended that Congress should be able to control the American executive as our Parliament controls ours. They placed the granting of supplies in the House of Representatives exclusively. But they forgot to look after paper money, and now it has been held that the President has power to emit such money without consulting Congress at all. The first part of the late war was so carried on by Mr. Lincoln, he relied not on the grants of Congress, but on the prerogative of emission. It sounds a joke, but it is true nevertheless, that this power to issue greenbacks is decided to belong to the President as Commander-in-Chief of the Army. It is part of what was called the war power. In truth, money was wanted in the late war, and the administration got it in the readiest way. And the nation, glad not to be more taxed, wholly approved of it. But the fact remains that the President has now, by precedent and decision, a mighty power to continue a war without the consent of Congress, and perhaps against its wish. Against the united will of the American people, a president would of course be impotent. Such is the genius of the place and nation that he would never think of it. But when the nation was, as of late, divided into 2 parties, one cleaving to the President, the other to the Congress, the now unquestionable power of the President to issue paper money may give him the power to continue the war, though Parliament, as we should speak, may enjoin the war to cease. And lastly, the whole region of the very highest questions is withdrawn from the ordinary authorities of the state and reserved for special authorities. The Constitution cannot be altered by any authorities within the Constitution, but only by authorities without it. Every alteration of it, however urgent or however trifling, must be sanctioned by a complicated proportion of states or legislatures. The consequence is that the most obvious evils cannot be quickly remedied. that the most absurd fictions must be framed to evade the plain sense of mischievous clauses, that a clumsy working and curious technicality mark the politics of a rough Andretti people. The practical arguments and the legal disquisitions in America are often like those of trustees carrying out a mistron while the sense of what they mean is good. But it can never be worked out fully or defended simply. So hampered is it by the old words of an Old Testament. These instances and others might be added prove, as history proves too, what was the principal thought of the American Constitution makers. They shrank from placing sovereign power anywhere. They feared that it would generate tyranny. George Roman III had been a tyrant to them, and come what might, they would not make a George Roman III. Accredited theories said that the English Constitution divided the sovereign authority, and in imitation the Americans split up theirs. The result is seen now. At the critical moment of their history, there is no ready, deciding power. The South, after a great rebellion, lies at the feet of its conquerors. Its conquerors have to settle what to do with it. They must decide the conditions upon which the secessionists shall again become fellow citizens, shall again vote, again be represented, again perhaps govern. The most difficult of problems is how to change late foes into free friends. The safety of their great public debt, and with that debt, their future credit and their whole power in future wars, may depend on their not giving too much power to those who must see in the debt the cost of their own subjugation, and who must have an inclination towards the repudiation of it, now that their own debt the cost of their defense has been repudiated. A race, too, formerly enslaved, is now at the mercy of men who hate and despise it, and those who set it free are bound to give it a fair chance for new life. The slave was formerly protected by his chains, he was an article of value. But now he belongs to himself, no one but himself has an interest in his life, and he is at the mercy of the mean whites, whose labor he depreciates, and who regard him with a loathing hatred. The greatest moral duty ever set before a government, and the most fearful political problem ever set before a government, are now set before the American. But there is no decision and no possibility of a decision. The president wants one course and has power to prevent any other. The Congress wants another course and has power to prevent any other. The splitting of sovereignty into many parts amounts to there being no sovereign. This was written just after the close of the Civil War, but I do not know that the great problem stated in it has as yet been adequately solved. The Americans of 1787 thought they were copying the English Constitution, but they were contriving a contrast to it. Just as the American is the type of composite governments, in which the supreme power is divided between many bodies and functionaries, so the English is the type of simple constitutions, in which the ultimate power upon all questions is in the hands of the same persons. The ultimate authority in the English Constitution is a newly elected House of Commons. No matter whether the question upon which it decides be administrative or legislative, no matter whether it concerns high matters of the essential constitution or small matters of daily detail, no matter whether it be a question of making a war or continuing a war, no matter whether it be the imposing a tax or the issuing a paper currency, no matter whether it be a question relating to India or Ireland or London, a new House of Commons can despotically and finally resolve. The House of Commons may, as was explained, assent in minor matters to the revision of the House of Lords, and submit in matters about which it cares little to the suspensive veto of the House of Lords. But when sure of the popular assent, and when freshly elected, it is absolute. It can rule as it likes and decide as it likes. And it can take the best security that it does not decide in vain. It can ensure that its decrees shall be executed, for it, and it alone, appoints the executive. It can inflict the most severe of all penalties on neglect, for it can remove the executive. It can choose to effect its wishes, those who wish the same, and so its will is sure to be done. A stipulated majority of both houses of the American Congress can overrule by stated enactment their executive, but the popular branch of our legislature can make and unmake ours. The English Constitution, in a word, is framed on the principle of choosing a single sovereign authority and making it good. The American, upon the principle of having many sovereign authorities and hoping that their multitude may atone for their inferiority. The Americans now extol their institutions, and so defraud themselves of their due praise. But if they had not a genius for politics, If they had not a moderation in action singularly curious where superficial speech is so violent, if they had not a regard for law, such as no great people have yet evinced, and infinitely surpassing ours, the multiplicity of authorities in the American Constitution would long ago have brought it to a bad end. Sensible shareholders, I have heard a shrewd attorney say, can work any deed of settlement. And so the men of Massachusetts could, I believe, work any constitution. But political philosophy must analyze political history. It must distinguish what is due to the excellence of the people and what to the excellence of the laws. It must carefully calculate the exact effect of each part of the Constitution, though thus it may destroy many an idol of the multitude and detect the secret of utility where but few imagined it to lie. Of course, I am not speaking here of the South and Southeast, as they now are. How any free government is to exist in societies where so many bad elements are so much perturbed, I cannot imagine. How important singleness and unity are in political action no one, I imagine, can doubt. We may distinguish and define its parts, but policy is a unit and a whole. It acts by laws by administrators. It requires now one, now the other. Unless it can easily move both, it will be impeded soon. Unless it has an absolute command of both, its work will be imperfect. The interlaced character of human affairs requires a single determining energy. A distinct force for each artificial compartment will make but a motley patchwork if it live long enough to make anything. The excellence of the British Constitution is that it has achieved this unity, that in it the sovereign power is single, possible, and good. The success is primarily due to the peculiar provision of the English Constitution, which places the choice of the executive in the people's house. But it could not have been thoroughly achieved except for two parts, which I venture to call the safety valve of the Constitution and the regulator. The safety valve is the peculiar provision of the Constitution, of which I spoke at great length in my essay on the House of Lords. The head of the executive can overcome the resistance of the second chamber by choosing new members of that chamber. If he do not find a majority, he can make a majority. This is a safety valve of the truest kind. It enables the popular, the will of which the executive is the exponent, the will of which it is the appointee to carry out within the Constitution desires and conceptions which one branch of the Constitution dislikes and resists. It lets forth a dangerous accumulation of inhibited power, which might sweep this Constitution before it, as like accumulations have often swept away like constitutions. The regulator, as I venture to call it, of our single sovereignty is the power of dissolving the otherwise sovereign chamber confided to the chief executive. The defects of the popular branch of a legislature as a sovereign have been expounded at length in a previous essay. Briefly, they may be summed up in three accusations. First, caprice is the commonest and most formidable vice of a choosing chamber. Wherever in our colonies parliamentary government is unsuccessful or is alleged to be unsuccessful, this is the vice which first impairs it. The assembly cannot be induced to maintain any administration. It shifts its selection now from one minister to another minister, and in consequence there is no government at all. Secondly, the very remedy for such caprice entails another evil. The only mode by which a cohesive majority and a lasting administration can be upheld in a parliamentary government is party organization. But that organization itself tends to aggravate party violence and party animosity. It is, in substance, subjecting the whole nation to the rule of a section of the nation, selected because of its speciality. Parliamentary government is, in its essence, a sectarian government, and is possible only when sects are cohesive. Thirdly, a parliament, like every other sort of sovereign, has peculiar feelings, peculiar prejudices, peculiar interests, and it may pursue these in opposition to the desires and even in opposition to the well-being of the nation. It has its selfishness as well as its caprice and its parties. The mode in which the regulating wheel of our Constitution produces its effect is plain. It does not impair the authority of Parliament as a species, but it impairs the power of the individual Parliament. It enables a particular person outside Parliament to say, "You members of Parliament are not doing your duty. You are gratifying caprice at the cost of the nation. You are indulging party spirit at the cost of the nation. You are helping yourself at the cost of the nation." I will see whether the nation approves what you are doing or not. I will appeal from Parliament number 1 to Parliament number 2. By far the best way to appreciate this peculiar provision of our Constitution is to trace it in action to see, as we saw before of the other powers of English royalty, how far it is dependent on the existence of an hereditary king, and how far it can be exercised by a premier whom Parliament elects. When we examine the nature of the particular person required to exercise the power, a vivid idea of that power is itself brought home to us. First, as to the caprice of Parliament in the choice of a premier, who is the best person to check it? Clearly the premier himself. He is the person most interested in maintaining his administration, and therefore the most likely person to use efficiently and dexterously the power by which it is to be maintained. The intervention of an extrinsic king occasions a difficulty. A capricious Parliament may always hope that his caprice may coincide with theirs. In the days when George Roman III assailed his governments, the premier was habitually deprived of his due authority. Intrigues were encouraged because it was always dubious whether the king-hated minister would be permitted to appeal from the intriguers, and always a chance that the conspiring monarch might appoint one of the conspirators to be premier in his room. The caprice of Parliament is better checked when the faculty of dissolution is entrusted to its appointee than when it is set apart in an outlying and an alien authority. But on the contrary, the party zeal and the self-seeking of Parliament are best checked by an authority which has no connection with Parliament or dependence, upon it supposing that such authority is morally and intellectually equal to the performance of the entrusted function. The Prime Minister, obviously being the nominee of a party majority, is likely to share its feeling, and is sure to be obliged to say that he shares it. The actual contact with affairs is indeed likely to purify him from many prejudices, to tame him of many fanaticisms, to beat out of him many errors. The present Conservative government contains more than one member who regards his party as intellectually benighted, who either never speaks their peculiar dialect or who speaks it condescendingly and with an aside, who respects their accumulated prejudices as the potential energies on which he subsists, but who despises them while he lives by them. Years ago, Mr. Disraeli called Sir Robert Peel's ministry the last Conservative ministry that had real power and organized hypocrisy. So much did the ideas of its head differ from the sensations of its tail. Probably he now comprehends, if he did not always, that the air of Downing Street brings certain ideas to those who live there, and that the hard, compact prejudices of opposition are soon melted and mitigated in the great Gulf Stream of affairs. Lord Palmerston, too, was a typical example of a leader lulling, rather than arousing, assuaging rather than acerbating the minds of his followers. But though the composing effect of close difficulties will commonly make a premier cease to be an immoderate partisan, yet a partisan to some extent he must be, and a violent one he may be, and in that case he is not a good person to check the party. When the leading sect, so to speak, in Parliament is doing what the nation do not like, an instant appeal ought to be registered and Parliament ought to be dissolved. But a zealot of a premier will not appeal. He will follow his formulae. He will believe he is doing good service when, perhaps, he is but pushing to unpopular consequences the narrow maxims of an inchoate theory. At such a minute, a constitutional king such as Leopold I was, and as Prince Albert might have been, is invaluable. He can and will prevent Parliament from hurting the nation. Again, too, on the selfishness of Parliament, an extrinsic check is clearly more efficient than an intrinsic. A premier who is made by Parliament may share the bad impulses of those who chose him, or, at any rate, he may have made capital out of them, he may have seemed to share them. The self-interests, the jobbing propensities of the Assembly are sure indeed to be of very secondary interest to him. What he will care most for is the permanence, is the interest whether corrupt or uncorrupt of his own ministry. He will be disinclined to anything coarsely unpopular. In the order of nature, a new Assembly must come before long, and he will be indisposed to shock the feelings of the electors from whom that Assembly must emanate. But though the interest of the minister is inconsistent with appalling jobbery, he will be inclined to mitigated jobbery. He will temporize, he will try to give a seemly dress to unseemly matters, to do as much harm as will content the Assembly, and yet not so much harm as will offend the nation. He will not shrink from becoming a particeps criminis. he will but endeavor to dilute the crime. The intervention of an extrinsic, impartial, and capable authority, if such, can be found, will undoubtedly restrain the covetousness as well as the factiousness of a choosing assembly. But can such a head be found? In one case, I think it has been found. Our colonial governors are precisely Deus ex machina. They are always intelligent, for they have to live by a different trade. They are nearly sure to be impartial, for they come from the ends of the earth. They are sure not to participate in the selfish desires of any colonial class or body. For long before those desires can have attained fruition, they will have passed to the other side of the world, be busy with other faces and other minds, be almost out of hearing what happens in a region they have half forgot. A colonial governor is a super-parliamentary authority, animated by a wisdom which is probably in quantity considerable, and is different from that of the local parliament, even if not above it. But even in this case, the advantage of this extrinsic authority is purchased at a heavy price, a price which must not be made light of, because it is often worth paying. A colonial governor is a ruler who has no permanent interest in the colony he governs, who perhaps had to look for it in the map when he was sent thither, who takes years before he really understands its parties and its controversies, who, though without prejudice himself, is apt to be a slave to the prejudices of local people near him, who inevitably and almost laudably governs not in the interest of the colony, which he may mistake, but in his own interest, which he sees and is sure of. The first desire of a colonial governor is not to get into a scrape, not to do anything which may give trouble to his superiors, the colonial office at home, which may cause an untimely and dubious recall, which may hurt his after career. He is sure to leave upon the colony the feeling that they have a ruler who only half knows them, and does not so much as half care for them. We hardly appreciate this common feeling in our colonies because we appoint their sovereign, but we should understand it in an instant if, by a political metamorphosis, the choice were turned the other way if they appointed our sovereign. We should then say at once, how is it possible a man from New Zealand can understand England? How is it possible that a man longing to get back to the Antipodes can care for England? How can we trust one who lives by the fluctuating favor of a distant authority? How can we heartily obey one who is but a foreigner with the accident of an identical language? I dwell on the evils which impair the advantage of colonial governorship, because that is the most favored case of super-parliamentary royalty, and because from looking at it, we can bring freshly home to our minds what the real difficulties of that institution are. We are so familiar with it that we do not understand it. We are like people who have known a man all their lives, and yet are quite surprised when he displays some obvious characteristic which casual observers have detected at a glance. I have known a man who did not know what color his sister's eyes were, though he had seen her every day for 20 years. Or rather, he did not know because he had so seen her. So true is the philosophical maxim that we neglect the constant element in our thoughts, though it is probably the most important, and attend almost only to the varying elements, the differentiating elements, as men now speak, though they are apt to be less potent. But when we perceive by the roundabout example of a colonial governor how difficult the task of a constitutional king is in the exercise of the function of dissolving parliament, we at once see how unlikely it is that an hereditary monarch will be possessed of the requisite faculties. An hereditary king is but an ordinary person, upon an average, at best. He is nearly sure to be badly educated for business. He is very little likely to have a taste for business. He is solicited from youth by every temptation to pleasure. He probably passed the whole of his youth in the vicious situation of the heir apparent, who can do nothing because he has no appointed work, and who will be considered almost to outstep his function if he undertake optional work. For the most part, a constitutional king is a damaged common man, not forced to business by necessity as a despot often is, but yet spoiled for business by most of the temptations which spoil a despot. History, too, seems to show that hereditary royal families gather from the repeated influence of their corrupting situation some dark taint in the blood, some transmitted and growing poison which hurts their judgments, darkens all their sorrow, and is a cloud on half their pleasure. It has been said, not truly, but with a possible approximation to truth, that in 1802 every hereditary monarch was insane. Is it likely that this sort of monarchs will be able to catch the exact moment when, in opposition to the wishes of a triumphant ministry, they ought to dissolve Parliament? To do so with efficiency, they must be able to perceive that the Parliament is wrong, and that the nation knows it is wrong. Now to know that Parliament is wrong, a man must be, if not a great statesman, yet a considerable statesman, a statesman of some sort. He must have great natural vigor, for no less will comprehend the hard principles of national policy. He must have incessant industry, for no less will keep him abreast with the involved detail to which those principles relate, and the miscellaneous occasions to which they must be applied. A man made common by nature, and made worse by life, is not likely to have either. He is nearly sure not to be both clever and industrious. And a monarch in the recesses of a palace, listening to a charmed flattery unbiased by the miscellaneous world, who has always been hedged in by rank, is likely to be but a poor judge of public opinion. He may have an inborn tact for finding it out, but his life will never teach it him, and will probably enfeeble it in him. But there is a still worse case, a case which the life of George Roman III, which is a sort of museum of the defects of a constitutional king, suggests at once. The Parliament may be wiser than the people, and yet the king may be of the same mind with the people. During the last years of the American War, the Premier, Lord North, upon whom the first responsibility rested, was averse to continuing it, and knew it could not succeed. Parliament was much of the same mind. If Lord North had been able to come down to Parliament with a peace in his hand, Parliament would probably have rejoiced, and the nation under the guidance of Parliament, though saddened by its losses, probably would have been satisfied. The opinion of that day was more like the American opinion of the present day than like our present opinion. It was much slower in its formation than our opinion now, and obeyed much more easily sudden impulses from the central administration. If Lord North had been able to throw the undivided energy and the undistracted authority of the executive government into the excellent work of making a peace and carrying a peace, years of bloodshed might have been spared, and an entail of enmity cut off that has not yet run out. But there was a power behind the Prime Minister. George Roman III was madly eager to continue the war, and the nation, not seeing how hopeless the strife was, not comprehending the lasting antipathy which their obstinacy was creating, ignorant, dull, and helpless, was ready to go on too. Even if Lord North had wished to make peace, and had persuaded Parliament accordingly, all his work would have been useless. A superior power could and would have appealed from a wise and pacific Parliament to a sullen and warlike nation. The check which our Constitution finds for the special vices of our Parliament was misused to curb its wisdom. The more we study the nature of cabinet government, the more we shall shrink from exposing at a vital instant its delicate machinery to a blow from a casual, incompetent, and perhaps semi-insane outsider. The preponderant probability is that on a great occasion the Premier and Parliament will really be wiser than the King. The Premier is sure to be able, and is sure to be most anxious to decide well. If he fail to decide, he loses his place, though through all blunders the King keeps his. The judgment of the man naturally very discerning is sharpened by a heavy penalty, from which the judgment of the man by nature much less intelligent is exempt. Parliament, too, is for the most part a sound, careful, and practical body of men. Principle shows that the power of dismissing a government with which Parliament is satisfied, and of dissolving that Parliament upon an appeal to the people, is not a power which a common hereditary monarch will in the long run be able beneficially to exercise. Accordingly, this power has almost, if not quite, dropped out of the reality of our Constitution. Nothing, perhaps, would more surprise the English people than if the Queen by a coup d'etat and on a sudden destroyed a ministry firm in the allegiance and secure of a majority in Parliament. That power, indisputably, in theory, belongs to her, but it has passed so far away from the minds of men that it would terrify them, if she used it, like a volcanic eruption from Primrose Hill. The last analogy to it is not one to be coveted as a precedent. In 1835, William Roman IV dismissed an administration which, though disorganized by the loss of its leader in the Commons, was an existing government, had a Premier in the Lords ready to go on, and a leader in the Commons willing to begin. The King fancied that public opinion was leaving the Whigs and going over to the Tories, and he thought he should accelerate the transition by ejecting the former. But the event showed that he misjudged. His perception indeed was right. The English people were wavering in their allegiance to the Whigs, who had no leader that touched the popular heart. none in whom liberalism could personify itself and become a passion who, besides, were a body long used to opposition, and therefore making blunders in office who were born to power by a popular impulse which they only half comprehended, and perhaps less than half shared. But the king's policy was wrong. He impeded the reaction instead of aiding it. He forced on a premature Tory government, which was as unsuccessful as all wise people perceived that it must be. The popular distaste to the Whigs was as yet but incipient, inefficient, and the intervention of the crown was advantageous to them because it looked inconsistent with the liberties of the people. And in so far as William Roman IV was right in detecting an incipient change of opinion, he did but detect an erroneous change. What was desirable was the prolongation of liberal rule. The commencing dissatisfaction did but relate to the personal demerits of the Whig leaders and other temporary adjuncts of free principles, and not to those principles intrinsically. So that the last precedent for a royal onslaught on a ministry ended thus: in opposing the right principles, in aiding the wrong principles, in hurting the party it was meant to help. After such a warning, it is likely that our monarchs will pursue the policy which a long course of quiet precedent at present directs. They will leave a ministry trusted by Parliament to the judgment of Parliament. Indeed, the dangers arising from a party spirit in Parliament exceeding that of the nation, and of a selfishness in Parliament contradicting the true interest of the nation, are not great dangers in a country where the mind of the nation is steadily political, and where its control over its representatives is constant. A steady opposition to a formed public opinion is hardly possible in our House of Commons. So incessant is the national attention to politics, and so keen the fear in the mind of each member that he may lose his valued seat. These dangers belong to early and scattered communities, where there are no interesting political questions, where the distances are great, where no vigilant opinion passes judgment on parliamentary excesses, where few care to have seats in the chamber, and where many of those few are from their characters, and their antecedents better not there than there. The one great vice of parliamentary government in an adult political nation is the caprice of Parliament in the choice of a ministry. A nation can hardly control it here, and it is not good that, except within wide limits, it should control it. The parliamentary judgment of the merits or demerits of an administration very generally depends on matters which the Parliament, being close at hand, distinctly sees, and which the distant nation does not see. But where personality enters, capriciousness begins. It is easy to imagine a House of Commons which is discontented with all statesmen, which is contented with none, which is made up of little parties, which votes in small knots, which will adhere steadily to no leader, which gives every leader a chance and a hope. Such parliaments require the imminent check of possible dissolution, but that check is, as has been shown, better in the premier than in the sovereign, and by the late practice of our Constitution, its use is yearly ebbing from the sovereign and yearly centering in the premier. The Queen can hardly now refuse a defeated minister the chance of a dissolution, any more than she can dissolve in the time of an undefeated one and without his consent. We shall find the case much the same with the safety valve, as I have called it, of our Constitution. A good, capable, hereditary monarch would exercise it better than a premier, but a premier could manage it well enough. And a monarch capable of doing better will be born only once in a century, whereas monarchs likely to do worse will be born every day. There are two modes in which the power of our executive to create appears to nominate, that is, additional members of our upper and revising chamber now acts. One constant, habitual, though not adequately noticed by the popular mind as it goes on, and the other possible and terrific, scarcely ever really exercised, but always by its reserved magic maintaining a great and a restraining influence. The Crown creates peers, a few year by year, and thus modifies continually the characteristic feeling of the House of Lords. I have heard people say, who ought to know, that the English peerage, the only one upon which unhappily the power of new creation now acts, is now more Whig than Tory. 30 years ago the majority was indisputably the other way. Owing to very curious circumstances, English parties have not alternated in power, as a good deal of speculation predicts they would, and a good deal of current language assumes they have. The Whig party were in office some 70 years, with very small breaks, from the death of Queen Anne to the coalition between Lord North and Mr. Fox. Then the Tories, with only such breaks, were in power for nearly 50 years, till 1832. And since, the Whig party has always, with very trifling intervals, been predominant. Consequently, each continuously governing party has had the means of modifying the upper house to suit its views. The profuse Tory creations of half a century had made the House of Lords bigotedly Tory before the first Reform Act, but it is wonderfully mitigated now. The Irish peers and Scotch peers being nominated by an almost unaltered constituency, and representing the feelings of the majority of that constituency, only no minority having any voice, present an unchangeable Tory element. But the element in which change is permitted has been changed. Whether the English peerage be or be not predominantly now Tory, it is certainly not Tory after the fashion of the Toryism of 1832. The Whig additions have indeed sprung from a class commonly rather adjoining upon Toryism than much inclining to radicalism. It is not from men of large wealth that a very great impetus to organic change should be expected. The additions to the peers have matched nicely enough with the old peers, and therefore they have effected more easily a greater and more permeating modification. The addition of a contrasting mass would have excited the old leaven, but the delicate infusion of ingredients similar in genus, though different in species, has modified the new compound without irritating the old original. This ordinary and common use of the peer-creating power is always in the hands of the premier, and depends for its characteristic use on being there. He, as the head of the predominant party, is the proper person to modify gradually the permanent chamber which perhaps was at starting hostile to him, and, at any rate, can be best harmonized with the public opinion he represents by the additions he makes. Hardly any contrived constitution possesses a machinery for modifying its secondary house so delicate, so flexible, and so constant. If the power of creating life peers had been added, the mitigating influence of the responsible executive upon the House of Lords would have been as good as such a thing can be. The catastrophic creation of peers for the purpose of swamping the upper house is utterly different. If an able and impartial exterior king is at hand, this power is best in that king. It is a power only to be used on great occasions, when the object is immense and the party strife unmitigated. This is the conclusive, the swaying power of the moment, and of course, therefore, it had better be in the hands of a power both capable and impartial, than of a premier who must in some degree be a partisan. The value of a discreet, calm, wise monarch, if such should happen to be reigning at the acute crisis of a nation's destiny, is priceless. He may prevent years of tumult, save bloodshed and civil war, lay up a store of grateful fame to himself, prevent the accumulated intestine hatred of each party to its opposite. But the question comes back, will there be such a monarch just then? What is the chance of having him just then? What will be the use of the monarch whom the accidents of inheritance, such as we know them to be, must upon an average bring us just then? The answer to these questions is not satisfactory, if we take it from the little experience we have had in this rare matter. There have been but 2 cases at all approaching to a catastrophic creation of peersta, a creation which would suddenly change the majority of the lords in English history. One was in Queen Anne's time. The majority of peers in Queen Anne's time were Whig, and by profuse and quick creations, Harley's ministry changed it to a Tory majority. So great was the popular effect that in the next reign, one of the most contested ministerial proposals was a proposal to take the power of indefinite peer creation from the Crown, and to make the number of lords fixed, as that of the Commons is fixed. But the sovereign had little to do with the matter. Queen Anne was one of the smallest people ever set in a great place. Swift bitterly and justly said she had not a store of amity by her for more than one friend at a time, and just then her affection was concentrated on a waiting-maid. Her waiting-maid told her to make peers, and she made them. But of large thought and comprehensive statesmanship she was as destitute as Mrs. Masham. She supported a bad ministry by the most extreme of measures, and she did it on caprice. The case of William Roman IV is still more instructive. He was a very conscientious king, but at the same time an exceedingly weak king. His correspondence with Lord Grey on this subject fills more than half a large volume, or rather his secretary's correspondence, for he kept a very clever man to write what he thought, or at least what those about him thought. It is a strange instance of high-placed weakness and conscientious vacillation. After endless letters, the king consents to make a reasonable number of peers if required to pass the second reading of the Reform Bill, but owing to desertion of the waverers from the Tories, the second reading is carried without it by 9, and then the king refuses to make peers, or at least enough peers when a vital amendment is carried by Lord Lyndhurst, which would have destroyed, and was meant to destroy the bill. In consequence, there was a tremendous crisis and nearly a revolution. A more striking example of well-meaning imbecility is scarcely to be found in history. No one who reads it carefully will doubt that the discretionary power of making peers would have been far better in Lord Grey's hands than in the king's. It was the uncertainty whether the king would exercise it, and how far he would exercise it, that mainly animated the opposition. In fact, you may place power in weak hands at a revolution, but you cannot keep it in weak hands. It runs out of them into strong ones. An ordinary hereditary sovereign, William Roman IV, or a George Roman IV, is unfit to exercise the peer-creating power when most wanted. A half-insane king, like George Roman III, would be worse. He might use it by unaccountable impulse when not required, and refuse to use it out of sullen madness when required. The existence of a fancied check on the premier is in truth an evil, because it prevents the enforcement of a real check. It would be easy to provide by law that an extraordinary number of peers, say, more than 10 annually, should not be created except on a vote of some large majority, suppose 3/4 of the lower house. This would ensure that the premier should not use the reserve force of the Constitution as if it were an ordinary force, that he should not use it except when the whole nation fixedly wished it, that it should be kept for a revolution, not expended on administration, and it would ensure that he should then have it to use. Queen Anne's case and William Roman IV's case prove that neither object is certainly attained by entrusting this critical and extreme force to the chance idiosyncrasies and habitual mediocrity of an hereditary sovereign. It may be asked why I argue at such length a question in appearance so removed from practice, and in one point of view so irrelevant to my subject. No one proposes to remove Queen Victoria. If anyone is in a safe place on earth, she is in a safe place. In these very essays it has been shown that the mass of our people would obey no one else, that the reverence she excites is the potential energy as science now speaks out of which all minor forces are made, and from which lesser functions take their efficiency. But looking not to the present hour, and this single country, but to the world at large and coming times, no question can be more practical. What grows upon the world is a certain matter of factness. The test of each century, more than of the century before, is the test of results. New countries are arising all over the world where there are no fixed sources of reverence, which have to make them, which have to create institutions which must generate loyalty by conspicuous utility. This matter of factness is the growth even in Europe of the two greatest and newest intellectual agencies of our time. One of these is business. We see so much of the material fruits of commerce that we forget its mental fruits. It begets a mind desirous of things, careless of ideas, not acquainted with the niceties of words. In all labor there should be profit, is its motto. It is not only true that we have left swords for ledgers, but war itself is made as much by the ledger as by the sword. The soldier, that is, the great soldier of today, is not a romantic animal, dashing at forlorn hopes, animated by frantic sentiment, full of fancies as to a ladylove or a sovereign, but a quiet, grave man, busied in charts, exact in sums, master of the art of tactics, occupied in trivial detail, thinking, as the Duke of Wellington was said to do, most of the shoes of his soldiers, despising all manner of eclat and eloquence, perhaps like Count Moltke, silent in 7 languages. We have reached a climate of opinion where figures rule, where our very supporter of divine right, as we deemed him, our Count Bismarck, amputates kings right and left, applies the test of results to each, and lets none live who are not to do something. There has in truth been a great change during the last 500 years in the predominant occupations of the ruling part of mankind. Formerly, they passed their time either in exciting action or inanimate repose. A feudal baron had nothing between war and the chase keenly animating things both and what was called inglorious ease. Modern life is scanty in excitements, but incessant in quiet action. Its perpetual commerce is creating a stock-taking habit, the habit of asking each man, thing, and institution, well, What have you done since I saw you last? Our physical science, which is becoming the dominant culture of thousands, and which is beginning to permeate our common literature to an extent which few watch enough, quite tends the same way. The two peculiarities are its homeliness and its inquisitiveness, its value for the most stupid facts, as one used to call them, and its incessant wish for verification to be sure, by tiresome seeing and hearing, that they are facts. The old excitement of thought has half died out, or rather it is diffused in quiet pleasure over life instead of being concentrated in intense and eager spasms. An old philosopher, Descartes, fancied that out of primitive truths, which he could by ardent excogitation know, he might by pure deduction evolve the entire universe. Intense self-examination and intense reason would, he thought, make out everything. The soul itself by itself could tell all it wanted if it would be true to its sublimer isolation. The greatest enjoyment possible to man was that which this philosophy promises its votaries the pleasure of being always right and always reasoning without ever being bound to look at anything. But our most ambitious schemes of philosophy now start quite differently. Mr. Darwin begins. When on board HMS Beagle, as naturalist, I was much struck with certain facts in the distribution of the organic beings inhabiting South America and in the geological relations of the present to the past inhabitants of that continent. These facts, as will be seen in the latter chapters of this volume, seem to throw some light on the origin of species, that mystery of mysteries, as it has been called by one of our greatest philosophers. On my return home, it occurred to me, in 1837, that something might perhaps be made out on this question by patiently accumulating and reflecting on all sorts of facts which could possibly have any bearing on it. After 5 years' work, I allowed myself to speculate on the subject and drew up some short notes. These I enlarged in 1844 into a sketch of the conclusions which then seemed to me probable. From that period to the present day, I have steadily pursued the same object. I hope that I may be excused for entering on these personal details, as I give them to show that I have not been hasty in coming to a decision. If he hopes finally to solve his great problem, it is by careful experiments in pigeon fancying and other sorts of artificial variety making. His hero is not an enclosed, excited philosopher, but that most skillful breeder, Sir John Sebright, who used to say, with respect to pigeons, that he would produce any given feathers in 3 years, but it would take him 6 years to obtain a head and a beak. I am not saying that the new thought is better than the old. It is no business of mine to say anything about that. I only wish to bring home to the mind, as nothing but instances can bring it home, how matter of fact, how petty, as it would at first sight look, even our most ambitious science has become. In the new communities which our emigrating habit now constantly creates, this prosaic turn of mind is intensified. In the American mind and in the colonial mind there is, as contrasted with the Old English mind, a literalness, a tendency to say, the facts are so and so, whatever may be thought or fancied about them. We used before the Civil War to say that the Americans worshipped the almighty dollar. We now know that they can scatter money almost recklessly when they will. But what we meant was half right. They worship visible value. Obvious, undeniable, intrusive result. And in Australia and New Zealand, the same turn comes uppermost. It grows from the struggle with the wilderness. Physical difficulty is the enemy of early communities, and an incessant conflict with it for generations leaves a mark of reality on the mind, a painful mark almost to us, used to impalpable fears and the half-fanciful dangers of an old and complicated society. The New Englands of all latitudes are bare-minded, if I may so say, as compared with the old. When, therefore, the new communities of the colonized world have to choose a government, they must choose one in which all the institutions are of an obvious, evident utility. We catch the Americans smiling at our Queen with her secret mystery, and our Prince of Wales with his happy inaction. It is impossible, in fact, to convince their prosaic minds that constitutional royalty is a rational government, that it is suited to a new age and an unbroken country, that those who start afresh can start with it. The princelings who run about the world with excellent intentions, but an entire ignorance of business, are to them a locomotive advertisement that this sort of government is European in its limitations and medieval in its origin. That though it has yet a great part to play in the old states, it has no place or part in new states. The realisme impitiable, which good critics find in a most characteristic part of the literature of the 19th century, is to be found also in its politics. An ostentatious utility must characterize its creations. The deepest interest, therefore, attaches to the problem of this essay. If hereditary royalty had been essential to parliamentary government, we might well have despaired of that government. But accurate investigation shows that this royalty is not essential, that upon an average, it is not even in a high degree useful, that though a king with high courage and fine discretion, a king with a genius for the place is always useful, and at rare moments priceless, yet that a common king, a king such as birth brings, is of no use at difficult crises, while in the common course of things his aid is neither likely nor required, he will do nothing, and he need do nothing. But we happily find that a new country need not fall back into the fatal division of powers incidental to a presidential government. It may, if other conditions serve, obtain the ready, well-placed, identical sort of sovereignty which belongs to the English Constitution, under the unroyal form of parliamentary government. Number Roman 8. The prerequisites of cabinet government and the peculiar form which they have assumed in England. Cabinet government is rare because its prerequisites are many. It requires the coexistence of several national characteristics which are not often found together in the world, and which should be perceived more distinctly than they often are. It is fancied that the possession of a certain intelligence and a few simple virtues are the sole requisites. The mental and moral qualities are necessary, but much else is necessary also. A cabinet government is the government of a committee selected by the legislature, and there are therefore a double set of conditions to it. First, those which are essential to all elective governments as such, and second, those which are requisite to this particular elective government. There are prerequisites for the genus and additional ones for the species. The first prerequisite of elective government is the mutual confidence of the electors. We are so accustomed to submit to be ruled by elected ministers that we are apt to fancy all mankind would readily be so too. Knowledge and civilization have at least made this progress, that we instinctively, without argument, almost without consciousness, allow a certain number of specified persons to choose our rulers for us. It seems to us the simplest thing in the world, but it is one of the gravest things. The peculiar marks of semi-barbarous people are diffused distrust and indiscriminate suspicion. People, in all but the most favored times and places, are rooted to the places where they were born, think the thoughts of those places, can endure no other thoughts. The next parish even is suspected. Its inhabitants have different usages, almost imperceptibly different, but yet different. They speak a varying accent. They use a few peculiar words. Tradition says that their faith is dubious. And if the next parish is a little suspected, the next county is much more suspected. Here is a definite beginning of new maxims, new thoughts, new ways. The immemorial boundary mark begins in feeling a strange world. And if the next county is dubious, a remote county is untrustworthy. Vagrants come from thence, men know, and they know nothing else. The inhabitants of the north speak a dialect different from the dialect of the south. They have other laws, another aristocracy, another life. In ages when distant territories are blanks in the mind, when neighborhood is a sentiment, When locality is a passion, concerted cooperation between remote regions is impossible even on trivial matters. Neither would rely enough upon the good faith, good sense, and good judgment of the other. Neither could enough calculate on the other. And if such cooperation is not to be expected in trivial matters, it is not to be thought of in the most vital matter of government, the choice of the executive ruler. To fancy that Northumberland in the 13th century would have consented to ally itself with Somersetshire for the choice of a chief magistrate is absurd. It would scarcely have allied itself to choose a hangman. Even now, if it were palpably explained, neither district would like it. But no one says at a county election, the object of this present meeting is to choose our delegate to what the Americans call the Electoral College, to the assembly which names our first magistrate, our substitute for their president. Representatives from this county will meet representatives from other counties, from cities and boroughs, and proceed to choose our rulers. Such bald exposition would have been impossible in old times. It would be considered queer, eccentric, if it were used now. Happily, the process of election is so indirect and hidden, and the introduction of that process was so gradual and latent that we scarcely perceive the immense political trust we repose in each other. The best mercantile credit seems to those who give it natural, simple, obvious. They do not argue about it or think about it. The best political credit is analogous. We trust our countrymen without remembering that we trust them. A second and very rare condition of an elective government is a calm national mind, a tone of mind sufficiently stable to bear the necessary excitement of conspicuous revolutions. No barbarous, no semi-civilized nation has ever possessed this. The mass of uneducated men could not now in England be told, go to choose your rulers. They would go wild, their imaginations would fancy unreal dangers, and the attempt at election would issue in some forcible usurpation. The incalculable advantage of august institutions in a free state is that they prevent this collapse. The excitement of choosing our rulers is prevented by the apparent existence of an unchosen ruler. The poorer and more ignorant classes, those who would most feel excitement, who would most be misled by excitement, really believe that the Queen governs. You could not explain to them the recondite difference between reigning and governing. The words necessary to express it do not exist in their dialect. The ideas necessary to comprehend it do not exist in their minds. The separation of principal power from principal station is a refinement which they could not even conceive. They fancy they are governed by an hereditary queen, a queen by the grace of God, when they are really governed by a cabinet and a parliament men like themselves, chosen by themselves. The conspicuous dignity awakens the sentiment of reverence, and men, often very undignified, seize the occasion to govern by means of it. Lastly, the third condition of all elective government is what I may call rationality, by which I mean a power involving intelligence, but yet distinct from it. A whole people electing its rulers must be able to form a distinct conception of distant objects. Mostly, the divinity that surrounds a king altogether prevents anything like a steady conception of him. You fancy that the object of your loyalty is as much elevated above you by intrinsic nature as he is by extrinsic position. You deify him in sentiment, as once men deified him in doctrine. This illusion has been and still is of incalculable benefit to the human race. It prevents, indeed, men from choosing their rulers. You cannot invest with that loyal illusion a man who was yesterday what you are, who tomorrow may be so again, whom you chose to be what he is. But though this superstition prevents the election of rulers, it renders possible the existence of unelected rulers. Untaught people fancy that their king, crowned with the holy crown, anointed with the oil of rhymes, descended of the house of Plantagenet, is a different sort of being from anyone not descended of the royal house, not crowned, not anointed. They believe that there is one man whom by mystic right they should obey, and therefore they do obey him. It is only in later times, when the world is wider, its experience larger, and its thought colder, that the plain rule of a palpably chosen ruler is even possible. These conditions narrowly restrict elective government, but the prerequisites of a cabinet government are rarer still. It demands not only the conditions I have mentioned, but the possibility likewise of a good legislature, a legislature competent to elect a sufficient administration. Now a competent legislature is very rare. Any permanent legislature at all, any constantly acting mechanism for enacting and repealing laws is, though it seems to us so natural, quite contrary to the inveterate conceptions of mankind. The great majority of nations conceive of their law either as something divinely given and therefore unalterable, or as a fundamental habit, inherited from the past to be transmitted to the future. The English Parliament, of which the prominent functions are now legislative, was not also once. It was rather a preservative body. The custom of the realm the aboriginal transmitted law, the law which was in the breast of the judges, could not be altered without the consent of Parliament, and therefore everybody felt sure it would not be altered except in grave, peculiar, and anomalous cases. The valued use of Parliament was not half so much to alter the law as to prevent the laws being altered. And such too was its real use. In early societies it matters much more that the law should be fixed than that it should be good. Any law which the people of ignorant times enact is sure to involve many misconceptions and to cause many evils. Perfection in legislation is not to be looked for, and is not, indeed, much wanted in a rude, painful, confined life. But such an age covets fixity. That men should enjoy the fruits of their labor, that the law of property should be known, that the law of marriage should be known, that the whole course of life should be kept in a calculable track, is the summum bonum of early ages, the first desire of semi-civilized mankind. In that age men do not want to have their laws adapted, but to have their laws steady. The passions are so powerful, force so eager, the social bond so weak, that the august spectacle of an all but unalterable law is necessary to preserve society. In the early stages of human society, all change is thought an evil, and most change is an evil. The conditions of life are so simple and so unvarying that any decent sort of rules suffice so long as men know what they are. Custom is the first check on tyranny, that fixed routine of social life at which modern innovations chafe, and by which modern improvement is impeded, is the primitive check on base power. The perception of political expediency has then hardly begun. The sense of abstract justice is weak and vague, and a rigid adherence to the fixed mold of transmitted usage is essential to an unmarred, unspoiled, unbroken life. In such an age, a legislature continuously sitting, always making laws, always repealing laws, would have been both an anomaly and a nuisance. But in the present state of the civilized part of the world, such difficulties are obsolete. There is a diffuse desire in civilized communities for an adjusting legislation, for a legislation which should adapt the inherited laws to the new wants of a world which now changes every day. It has ceased to be necessary to maintain bad laws because it is necessary to have some laws. Civilization is robust enough to bear the incision of legal improvements. But taking history at large, the rarity of cabinets is mostly due to the greater rarity of continuous legislatures. Other conditions, however, limit even at the present day the area of a cabinet government. It must be possible to have not only a legislature, but to have a competent legislature, a legislature willing to elect and willing to maintain an efficient executive. And this is no easy matter. It is indeed true that we need not trouble ourselves to look for that elaborate and complicated organization which partially exists in the House of Commons, and which is more fully and freely expanded in plans for improving the House of Commons. We are not now concerned with perfection or excellence. We seek only for simple fitness and bare competency. The conditions of fitness are two. First, you must get a good legislature, and next, you must keep it good. And these are by no means so nearly connected as might be thought at first sight. To keep a legislature efficient, it must have a sufficient supply of substantial business. If you employ the best set of men to do nearly nothing, they will quarrel with each other about that nothing. Where great questions end, little parties begin. And a very happy community, with few new laws to make, few old bad laws to repeal, and but simple foreign relations to adjust, has great difficulty in employing a legislature. There is nothing for it to enact, and nothing for it to settle. Accordingly, there is great danger that the legislature, being debarred from all other kind of business, may take to quarreling about its elective business. That controversies as to ministries may occupy all its time, and yet that time be perniciously employed. That a constant succession of feeble administrations, unable to govern and unfit to govern, may be substituted for the proper result of cabinet government a sufficient body of men long enough in power to evince their sufficiency. The exact amount of non-elective business necessary for a parliament which is to elect the executive cannot, of course, be formally stated. There are no numbers and no statistics in the theory of constitutions. All we can say is that a parliament with little business, which is to be as efficient as a parliament with much business, must be in all other respects much better. An indifferent parliament may be much improved by the steadying effect of grave affairs. But a parliament which has no such affairs must be intrinsically excellent, or it will fail utterly. But the difficulty of keeping a good legislature is evidently secondary to the difficulty of first getting it. There are two kinds of nations which can elect a good parliament. The first is a nation in which the mass of the people are intelligent and in which they are comfortable. Where there is no honest poverty, where education is diffused and political intelligence is common, it is easy for the mass of the people to elect a fair legislature. The idea is roughly realized in the North American colonies of England and in the whole free states of the Union. In these countries, there is no such thing as honest poverty. Physical comfort, such as the poor cannot imagine here, is there easily attainable by healthy industry. Education is diffused much and is fast spreading. Ignorant emigrants from the Old World often prize the intellectual advantages of which they are themselves destitute, and are annoyed at their inferiority in a place where rudimentary culture is so common. The greatest difficulty of such new communities is commonly geographical. The population is mostly scattered, and where population is sparse, discussion is difficult. But in a country very large, as we reckon in Europe, a people really intelligent, really educated, really comfortable, would soon form a good opinion. No one can doubt that the New England states, if they were a separate community, would have an education, a political capacity, and an intelligence such as the numerical majority of no people, equally numerous, has ever possessed. In a state of this sort, where all the community is fit to choose a sufficient legislature, it is possible, it is almost easy, to create that legislature. If the New England states possessed a cabinet government as a separate nation, they would be as renowned in the world for political sagacity as they now are for diffused happiness. The structure of these communities is indeed based on the principle of equality, and it is impossible that any such community can wholly satisfy the severe requirements of a political theorist. In every old community, its primitive and guiding assumption is at war with truth. By its theory, all people are entitled to the same political power, and they can only be so entitled on the ground that in politics they are equally wise. But at the outset of an agricultural colony, this postulate is as near the truth as politics want. There are in such communities no large properties, no great capitals, no refined classes. Everyone is comfortable and homely, and no one is at all more. Equality is not artificially established in a new colony, it establishes itself. There is a story that among the first settlers in Western Australia, some, who were rich, took out laborers at their own expense and also carriages to ride in. But soon they had to try if they could live in the carriages. Before the masters' houses were built, the laborers had gone off. They were building houses and cultivating land for themselves, and the masters were left to sit in their carriages. Whether this exact thing happened, I do not know, but this sort of thing has happened 1,000 times. There has been a whole series of attempts to transplant to the colonies a graduated English society, but they have always failed at the first step. The rude classes at the bottom felt that they were equal to or better than the delicate classes at the top. They shifted for themselves and left the gentlefolks to shift for themselves. The base of the elaborate pyramid spread abroad, and the apex tumbled in and perished. In the early ages of an agricultural colony, whether you have political democracy or not, social democracy you must have, for nature makes it, and not you. But in time, wealth grows and inequality begins. A and his children are industrious and prosper. B and his children are idle and fail. If manufactures on a considerable scale are established, and most young communities strive, even by protection, to establish them, the tendency to inequality is intensified. The capitalist becomes a unit with much, and his laborers a crowd with little. After generations of education, too, there arise varieties of culture. There will be an upper 1,000 or 10,000 of highly cultivated people in the midst of a great nation of moderately educated people. In theory, it is desirable that this highest class of wealth and leisure should have an influence far out of proportion to its mere number. A perfect constitution would find for it a delicate expedient to make its fine thought tell upon the surrounding cruder thought. But as the world goes, when the whole of the population is as instructed and as intelligent as in the case I am supposing, we need not care much about this. Great communities have scarcely ever never save for transient moments been ruled by their highest thought, and if we can get them ruled by a decent capable thought, we may be well enough contented with our work. We have done more than could be expected, though not all which could be desired. At any rate, an isocratic polity where every one votes, and where every one votes alike is, in a community of sound education and diffused intelligence, a conceivable case of cabinet government. It satisfies the essential condition. There is a people able to elect, a parliament able to choose. But suppose the mass of the people are not able to elect, and this is the case with the numerical majority of all but the rarest nations. How is a cabinet government to be then possible? It is only possible in what I may venture to call deferential nations. It has been thought strange, but there are nations in which the numerous unwiser part wishes to be ruled by the less numerous wiser part. The numerical majority, whether by custom or by choice, is immaterial, is ready, is eager to delegate its power of choosing its ruler to a certain select minority. It abdicates in favor of its elite and consents to obey whoever that elite may confide in. It acknowledges as its secondary electors as the choosers of its government an educated minority, at once competent and unresisted. It has a kind of loyalty to some superior persons who are fit to choose a good government and whom no other class opposes. A nation in such a happy state as this has obvious advantages for constructing a cabinet government. It has the best people to elect a legislature, and therefore it may fairly be expected to choose a good legislature, a legislature competent to select a good administration. England is the type of deferential countries, and the manner in which it is so, and has become so, is extremely curious. The middle classes, the ordinary majority of educated men, are, in the present day, the despotic power in England. Public opinion, nowadays, is the opinion of the bald-headed man at the back of the omnibus. It is not the opinion of the aristocratical classes as such, or of the most educated or refined classes as such. It is simply the opinion of the ordinary mass of educated, but still commonplace mankind. If you look at the mass of the constituencies, you will see that they are not very interesting people. And perhaps if you look behind the scenes and see the people who manipulate and work the constituencies, you will find that these are yet more uninteresting. The English Constitution in its palpable form is this: the mass of the people yield obedience to a select few. And when you see this select few, you perceive that though not of the lowest class, nor of an unrespectable class, they are yet of a heavy, sensible class, the last people in the world to whom, if they were drawn up in a row, an immense nation would ever give an exclusive preference. In fact, the mass of the English people yield a deference rather to something else than to their rulers. They defer to what we may call the theatrical show of society. A certain state passes before them, a certain pomp of great men, a certain spectacle of beautiful women, a wonderful scene of wealth and enjoyment is displayed, and they are coerced by it. Their imagination is bowed down, they feel they are not equal to the life which is revealed to them. Courts and aristocracies have the great quality which rules the multitude, though philosophers can see nothing in it visibility. Courtiers can do what others cannot. A common man may as well try to rival the actors on the stage in their acting as the aristocracy in their acting. The higher world, as it looks from without, is a stage on which the actors walk their parts much better than the spectators can. This play is played in every district. Every rustic feels that his house is not like my lord's house, his life like my lord's life, his wife like my lady. The climax of the play is the queen. Nobody supposes that their house is like the court, their life like her life, her orders like their orders. There is in England a certain charmed spectacle which imposes on the many and guides their fancies as it will. As a rustic on coming to London finds himself in presence of a great show and vast exhibition of inconceivable mechanical things, so by the structure of our society, he finds himself face to face with a great exhibition of political things which he could not have imagined. which he could not make to which he feels in himself scarcely anything analogous. Philosophers may deride this superstition, but its results are inestimable. By the spectacle of this august society, countless ignorant men and women are induced to obey the few nominal electors, the LL0 borough renters, and the L50 county renters who have nothing imposing about them, nothing which would attract the eye or fascinate the fancy. What impresses men is not mind, but the result of mind. And the greatest of these results is this wonderful spectacle of society, which is ever new and yet ever the same, in which accidents pass and essence remains, in which one generation dies and another succeeds, as if they were birds in a cage or animals in a menagerie, of which it seems almost more than a metaphor to treat the parts as limbs of a perpetual living thing, so silently do they seem to change, so wonderfully, and so perfectly does the conspicuous life of the new year take the place of the conspicuous life of last year. The apparent rulers of the English nation are like the most imposing personages of a splendid procession. It is by them the mob are influenced. It is they whom the spectators cheer. The real rulers are secreted in second-rate carriages. No one cares for them or asks about them, but they are obeyed implicitly and unconsciously by reason of the splendor of those who eclipsed and preceded them. It is quite true that this imaginative sentiment is supported by a sensation of political satisfaction. It cannot be said that the mass of the English people are well off. There are whole classes who have not a conception of what the higher orders call comfort, who have not the prerequisites of moral existence, who cannot lead the life that becomes a man. But the most miserable of these classes do not impute their misery to politics. If a political agitator were to lecture to the peasants of Dorsetshire and try to excite political dissatisfaction, it is much more likely that he would be pelted than that he would succeed. Of Parliament, these miserable creatures know scarcely anything. Of the cabinet, they never heard. But they would say that, for all they have heard, the Queen is very good, and rebelling against the structure of society is to their minds rebelling against the Queen, who rules that society, in whom all its most impressive part the part that they know culminates. The mass of the English people are politically contented as well as politically deferential. A deferential community, even though its lowest classes are not intelligent, is far more suited to a cabinet government than any kind of democratic country, because it is more suited to political excellence. The highest classes can rule in it, and the highest classes must, as such, have more political ability than the lower classes. A life of labor, an incomplete education, a monotonous occupation, a career in which the hands are used much and the judgment is used little, cannot create as much flexible thought, as much applicable intelligence as a life of leisure, a long culture, a varied experience, an existence by which the judgment is incessantly exercised, and by which it may be incessantly improved. A country of respectful poor, though far less happy than where there are no poor to be respectful, is nevertheless far more fitted for the best government. You can use the best classes of the respectful country. You can only use the worst where every man thinks he is as good as every other. It is evident that no difficulty can be greater than that of founding a deferential nation. Respect is traditional. It is given not to what is proved to be good, but to what is known to be old. Certain classes in certain nations retain by common acceptance a marked political preference, because they have always possessed it, and because they inherit a sort of pomp which seems to make them worthy of it. But in a new colony, in a community where merit may be equal, and where there cannot be traditional marks of merit and fitness, it is obvious that a political deference can be yielded to higher culture only upon proof, first of its existence and next of its political value. But it is nearly impossible to give such a proof so as to satisfy persons of less culture. In a future and better age of the world it may be effected, but in this age the requisite premises scarcely exist. If the discussion be effectually open, if the debate be fairly begun, it is hardly possible to obtain a rational, an argumentative acquiescence in the rule of the cultivated few. As yet the few rule by their hold, not over the reason of the multitude, but over their imaginations and their habits, over their fancies as to distant things they do not know at all, over their customs as to near things which they know very well. A deferential community in which the bulk of the people are ignorant is therefore in a state of what is called in mechanics unstable equilibrium. If the equilibrium is once disturbed, there is no tendency to return to it, but rather to depart from it. A cone balanced on its point is in unstable equilibrium, for if you push it ever so little it will depart farther and farther from its position and fall to the earth. So in communities where the masses are ignorant but respectful, if you once permit the ignorant class to begin to rule, you may bid farewell to deference forever. Their demagogues will inculcate, their newspapers will recount, that the rule of the existing dynasty, the people, is better than the rule of the fallen dynasty, the aristocracy. A people very rarely hears two sides of a subject in which it is much interested. The popular organs take up the side which is acceptable, and none but the popular organs in fact reach the people. A people never hears censure of itself. No one will tell it that the educated minority whom it dethroned governed better or more wisely than it governs. A democracy will never, save after an awful catastrophe, return what has once been conceded to it, for to do so would be to admit an inferiority in itself, of which, except by some almost unbearable misfortune, it could never be convinced. Note Roman 9. Its history and the effects of that history conclusion. A volume might seem wanted to say anything worth saying on the history of the English Constitution, and a great and new volume might still be written on it, if a competent writer took it in hand. The subject has never been treated by anyone combining the lights of the newest research and the lights of the most matured philosophy. Since the masterly Book of Hallam was written, both political thought and historical knowledge have gained much, and we might have a treatise applying our strengthened calculus to our augmented facts. I do not pretend that I could write such a book, but there are a few salient particulars which may be fitly brought together, both because of their past interest and of their present importance. Since the first edition of this book was published, several valuable works have appeared, which, on many points, throw much light on our early constitutional history, especially Mr. Stubbs' select charters and other illustrations of English constitutional history, from the earliest times to the reign of Edward I, Mr. Freeman's lecture on the growth of the English Constitution, and the chapter on the Anglo-Saxon Constitution in his History of the Norman Conquest. But we have not yet a great and authoritative work on the whole subject, such as I wished for when I wrote the passage in the text, and as it is most desirable that we should have. There is a certain common polity, or germ of polity, which we find in all the rude nations that have attained civilization. These nations seem to begin in what I may call a consultative and tentative absolutism. The king of early days, in vigorous nations, was not absolute as despots now are. There was then no standing army to repress rebellion, no organized espionage to spy out discontent, no skilled bureaucracy to smooth the ruts of obedient life. The early king was indeed consecrated by a religious sanction. He was essentially a man apart, a man above others, divinely anointed or even God-begotten. But in nations capable of freedom, this religious domination was never despotic. There was indeed no legal limit. The very words could not be translated into the dialect of those times. The notion of law as we have it of a rule imposed by human authority, capable of being altered by that authority, when it likes, and in fact, so altered habitually could not be conveyed to early nations, who regarded law half as an invincible prescription and half as a divine revelation. Law came out of the king's mouth. He gave it as Solomon gave judgment embedded in the particular case, and upon the authority of heaven as well as his own. A divine limit to the divine revealer was impossible, and there was no other source of law. But though there was no legal limit, there was a practical limit to subjection in what may be called the pagan part of human nature, the inseparable obstinacy of freemen. They never would do exactly what they were told. To early royalty, as Homer describes it in Greece and as we may well imagine it elsewhere, there were always two adjuncts. One, the old men, the men of weight, the council, the boule of which the king asked advice, from the debates in which the king tried to learn what he could do and what he ought to do. Besides this, there was the agora, the purely listening assembly, as some have called it, but the tentative assembly, as I think it might best be called. The king came down to his assembled people in form to announce his will, but in reality, speaking in very modern words, to feel his way. He was sacred, no doubt, and popular, very likely. Still, he was half like a popular premier speaking to a high-spirited chamber. There were limits to his authority and power limits which he would discover by trying whether eager cheers received his mandate or only hollow murmurs and a thinking silence. This polity is a good one for its era and its place, but there is a fatal defect in it. The reverential associations upon which the government is built are transmitted according to one law, and the capacity needful to work the government is transmitted according to another law. The popular homage clings to the line of God-descended kings. It is transmitted by inheritance. But very soon that line comes to a child or an idiot, or one by some defect or other incapable. Then we find everywhere the truth of the old saying, that liberty thrives under weak princes. Then the listening assembly begins not only to murmur, but to speak. Then the grave council begins not so much to suggest as to inculcate, not so much to advise as to enjoin. Mr. Grote has told at length how out of these appendages of the original kingdom the free states of Greece derived their origin, and how they gradually grew, the oligarchical states expanding the council, and the democratical expanding the assembly. The history has as many varieties in detail as there were Greek cities, but the essence is the same everywhere. The political characteristic of the early Greeks, and of the early Romans too, is that out of the tentacula of a monarchy, they developed the organs of a republic. English history has been in substance the same, though its form is different, and its growth far slower and longer. The scale was larger, and the elements more various. A Greek city soon got rid of its kings, for the political sacredness of the monarch would not bear the daily inspection and constant criticism of an eager and talking multitude. Everywhere in Greece, the slave population, the most ignorant, and therefore the most unsusceptible of intellectual influences, was struck out of the account. But England began as a kingdom of considerable size, inhabited by distinct races, none of them fit for prosaic criticism, and all subject to the superstition of royalty. In early England, too, royalty was much more than a superstition. A very strong executive was needed to keep down a divided, an armed, and an impatient country, and therefore the problem of political development was delicate. A formed free government in a homogeneous nation may have a strong executive, but during the transition state, while the republic is in course of development and the monarchy in course of decay, the executive is of necessity weak. The polity is divided, and its action feeble and failing. The different orders of English people have progressed, too, at different rates. The change in the state of the higher classes since the Middle Ages is enormous, and it is all improvement. But the lower have varied little, and many argue that in some important respects they have got worse, even if in others they have got better. The development of the English Constitution was of necessity slow, because a quick one would have destroyed the executive and killed the state, and because the most numerous classes, who changed very little, were not prepared for any catastrophic change in our institutions. I cannot presume to speak of the time before the conquest, and the exact nature even of all Anglo-Norman institutions is perhaps dubious. At least, in nearly all cases there have been many controversies. Political zeal, whether Whig or Tory, has wanted to find a model in the past. And the whole state of society being confused, the precedents altering with the caprice of men and the chance of events, ingenious advocacy has had a happy field. But all that I need speak of is quite plain. There was a great council of the realm, to which the king summoned the most considerable persons in England, the persons he most wanted to advise him, and the persons whose tempers he was most anxious to ascertain. Exactly who came to it at first is obscure and unimportant. I need not distinguish between the magnum concilium in Parliament and the magnum concilium out of Parliament. Gradually, the principal assemblies summoned by the English sovereign took the precise and definite form of Lords and Commons, as in their outside we now see them. But their real nature was very different. The Parliament of today is a ruling body. The medieval Parliament was, if I may so say, an expressive body. Its function was to tell the executive the king what the nation wished he should do, to some extent, to guide him by new wisdom, and, to a very great extent, to guide him by new facts. These facts were their own feelings, which were the feelings of the people, because they were part and parcel of the people. From thence the king learned, or had the means to learn, what the nation would endure, and what it would not endure, what he might do, and what he might not do. If he much mistook this, there was a rebellion. There are, as is well known, 3 great periods in the English Constitution. The first of these is the ante-Tudor period. The English Parliament then seemed to be gaining extraordinary strength and power. The title to the crown was uncertain. Some monarchs were imbecile. Many ambitious men wanted to take the people into partnership. Certain precedents of that time were cited with grave authority centuries after, when the time of freedom had really arrived. But the causes of this rapid growth soon produced an even more sudden decline. Confusion fostered it, and confusion destroyed it. The structure of society then was feudal. The towns were only an adjunct and a make-weight. The principal popular force was an aristocratic force, acting with the cooperation of the gentry and yeomanry and resting on the loyal fealty of sworn retainers. The head of this force, on whom its efficiency depended, was the high nobility. But the high nobility killed itself out. The great barons who adhered to the red rose or the white rose, or who fluctuated from one to the other, became poorer, fewer, and less potent every year. When the great struggle ended at Bosworth, a large part of the greatest combatants were gone. The restless, aspiring, rich barons who made the Civil War were broken by it. Henry Roman VII attained a kingdom in which there was a parliament to advise, but scarcely a parliament to control. The consultative government of the ante-Tudor period had little resemblance to some of the modern governments which French philosophers call by that name. The French Empire, I believe, calls itself so, but its assemblies are symmetrical shams. They are elected by a universal suffrage, by the ballot, and in districts once marked out with an eye to equality and still retaining a look of equality. But our English parliaments were unsymmetrical realities. They were elected anyhow. The sheriff had a considerable license in sending writs to boroughs, that is, he could in part pick its constituencies. And in each borough there was a rush and scramble for the franchise, so that the strongest local party got it, whether few or many. But in England at that time, there was a great and distinct desire to know the opinion of the nation, because there was a real and close necessity. The nation was wanted to do something to assist the sovereign in some war, to pay some old debt, to contribute its force and aid in the critical conjuncture of the time. It would not have suited the ante-Tudor kings to have had a fictitious assembly. They would have lost their sole feeler, their only instrument for discovering national opinion. Nor could they have manufactured such an assembly if they wished. The instrument in that behalf is the centralized executive, and there was then no prefet by whom the opinion of a rural locality could be made to order, and adjusted to suit the wishes of the capital. Looking at the mode of election, a theorist would say that these parliaments were but chance collections of influential Englishmen. There would be many corrections and limitations to add to that statement if it were wanted to make it accurate, but the statement itself hits exactly the principal excellence of those parliaments. If not chance collections of Englishmen, they were undesigned collections. No administrations made them or could make them. They were bona fide councillors, whose opinion might be wise or unwise, but was anyhow of paramount importance, because their cooperation was wanted for what was in hand. Legislation as a positive power was very secondary in those old parliaments. I believe no statute at all, as far as we know, was passed in the reign of Richard I, and all the anti-Tudor acts together would look meager enough to a modern parliamentary agent who had to live by them. But the negative action of Parliament upon the law was essential to its whole idea and ran through every part of its use. That the king could not change what was then the almost sacred datum of the common law, without seeing whether his nation liked it or not, was an essential part of the tentative system. The king had to feel his way in this exceptional, singular act, as those ages deemed original legislation, as well as in lesser acts. The legislation was his at last. He enacted after consulting his lords and commons. His was the sacred mouth which gave holy firmness to the enactment, but he only dared alter the rule regulating the common life of his people after consulting those people. He would not have been obeyed if he had not, by a rude age which did not fear civil war as we fear it now. Many most important enactments of that period, and the fact is most characteristic, are declaratory acts. They do not profess to enjoin by inherent authority what the law shall in future be, but to state and mark what the law is. They are declarations of immemorial custom, not precepts of new duties. Even in the Great Charter, the notion of new enactments was secondary. It was a great mixture of old and new. It was a sort of compact defining what was doubtful in floating custom, and was reenacted over and over again, as boundaries are perambulated once a year, and rights and claims tending to desuetude thereby made patent and cleared of new obstructions. In truth, such great charters were rather treaties between different orders and factions, confirming ancient rights, or what claimed to be such, than laws in our ordinary sense. They were the deeds of arrangement of medieval society affirmed and reaffirmed from time to time. And the principal controversy was, of course, between the king and nation the king trying to see how far the nation would let him go, and the nation murmuring and recalcitrating, and seeing how many acts of administration they could prevent, and how many of its claims they could resist. Sir James Mackintosh says that Magna Charta converted the right of taxation into the shield of liberty. But it did nothing of the sort. The liberty existed before, and the right to be taxed was an efflorescence and instance of it, not a substratum or a cause. The necessity of consulting the great council of the realm before taxation. The principle that the declaration of grievances by the Parliament was to precede the grant of supplies to the sovereign, are but conspicuous instances of the primitive doctrine of the ante-Tudor period, that the king must consult the great council of the realm before he did anything, since he always wanted help. The right of self-taxation was justly inserted in the Great Treaty, but it would have been a dead letter, save for the armed force and aristocratic organization which compelled the king to make a treaty. It was a result, not a basis and example, not a cause. The civil wars of many years killed out the old councils, if I might so say. That is, destroyed 3 parts of the greater nobility, who were its most potent members, tired the small nobility and the gentry, and overthrew the aristocratic organization on which all previous effectual resistance to the sovereign had been based. The second period of the British Constitution begins with the accession of the House of Tudor and goes down to 1688. It is in substance the history of the growth, development, and gradually acquired supremacy of the new Great Council. I have no room and no occasion to narrate again the familiar history of the many steps by which the slavish Parliament of Henry Roman VIII grew into the murmuring Parliament of Queen Elizabeth, the mutinous Parliament of James I, and the rebellious Parliament of Charles I. The steps were many, but the energy was one the growth of the English middle class, using that word in its most inclusive sense, and its animation under the influence of Protestantism. No one, I think, can doubt that Lord Macaulay is right in saying that political causes would not alone have then provoked such a resistance to the sovereign unless propelled by religious theory. Of course, the English people went to and fro from Catholicism to Protestantism, and from Protestantism to Catholicism, not to mention that the Protestantism was of several shades and sects, just as the first Tudor kings and queens wished. But that was in the pre-Puritan era. The mass of Englishmen were in an undecided state, just as Hooper tells us his father was not believing in Protestantism, yet not disinclined to it. Gradually, however, a strong evangelic spirit, as we should now speak, and a still stronger anti-papal spirit entered into the middle sort of Englishmen, and added to that force, fiber, and substance which they have never wanted, an ideal warmth and fervor which they have almost always wanted. Hence the saying that Cromwell founded the English Constitution. Of course, in seeming, Cromwell's work died with him. His dynasty was rejected, his republic cast aside. But the spirit which culminated in him never sank again, never ceased to be a potent, though often a latent and volcanic force in the country. Charles Roman II said that he would never go again on his travels for anything or anybody, and he well knew that though the men whom he met at Worcester might be dead, still the spirit which warmed them was alive and young in others. But the Cromwellian Republic and the strict Puritan creed were utterly hateful to most Englishmen. They were, if I may venture on saying so, like the Rouge element in France and elsewhere, the sole revolutionary force in the entire state, and were hated as such. That force could do little of itself. Indeed, its bare appearance tended to frighten and alienate the moderate and dull as well as the refined and reasoning classes. Alone it was impotent against the solid clay of the English apathetic nature. But give this fiery element a body of decent-looking earth. Give it an excuse for breaking out on an occasion when the decent, the cultivated and aristocratic classes could join with it, and they would conquer by means of it, and it could be disguised in their covering. Such an excuse was found in 1688. James Roman II, by incredible and pertinacious folly, irritated not only the classes which had fought against his father, but also those who had fought for his father. He offended the Anglican classes as well as the Puritan classes, all the Whig nobles, and half the Tory nobles, as well as the dissenting bourgeois. The rule of Parliament was established by the concurrence of the usual supporters of royalty with the usual opponents of it. But the result was long weak. Our revolution has been called the minimum of a revolution, because in law, at least, it only changed the dynasty. But exactly on that account, it was the greatest shock to the common multitude, who see the dynasty but see nothing else. The support of the main aristocracy held together the bulk of the deferential classes, but it held them together imperfectly, uneasily, and unwillingly. Huge masses of crude prejudice swayed hither and thither for many years. If an able Stuart had with credible sincerity professed Protestantism, probably he might have overturned the House of Hanover. So strong was inbred reverence for hereditary right that until the accession of George Roman III, the English government was always subject to the unceasing attrition of a competitive sovereign. This was the result of what I insist on tediously, but what is most necessary to insist on, for it is a cardinal particular in the whole topic. Many of the English people, the higher and more educated portion, had come to comprehend the nature of constitutional government, but the mass did not comprehend it. They looked to the sovereign as the government, and to the sovereign only. These were carried forward by the magic of the aristocracy, and principally by the influence of the great Whig families with their adjuncts. Without that aid, reason or liberty would never have held them. Though the rule of Parliament was definitely established in 1688, yet the mode of exercising that rule has since changed. At first, Parliament did not know how to exercise it. The organization of parties and the appointment of cabinets by parties grew up in the manner Macaulay has described so well. Up to the latest period, the sovereign was supposed, to a most mischievous extent, to interfere in the choice of the persons to be ministers. When George Roman III finally became insane in 1810, everyone believed that George Roman IV, on assuming power as Prince Regent, would turn out Mr. Perceval's government and empower Lord Grey or Lord Grenville, the Whig leaders, to form another. The Tory ministry was carrying on a successful war of existence against Napoleon, but in the people's minds, the necessity at such an occasion for an unchanged government did not outweigh the fancy that George Roman IV was a Whig. And a Whig, it is true, he had been before the French Revolution, when he lived an indescribable life in St. James's Street with Mr. Fox. But Lord Grey and Lord Grenville were rigid men and had no immoral sort of influence. What liberalism of opinion the regent ever had was frightened out of him, as of other people, by the reign of terror. He felt, according to the saying of another monarch, that he lived by being a royalist. It soon appeared that he was most anxious to retain Mr. Perceval, and that he was most eager to quarrel with the Whig lords. As we all know, he kept the ministry whom he found in office, but that it should have been thought he could then change them is a significant example how exceedingly modern our notions of the despotic action of Parliament in fact are. By the steps of the struggle thus rudely mentioned, and by others which I have no room to speak of, nor need I, The change, which in the Greek cities was affected both in appearance and in fact, has been affected in England, though in reality only and not in outside. Here, too, the appendages of a monarchy have been converted into the essence of a republic. Only here, because of a more numerous heterogeneous political population, it is needful to keep the ancient show while we secretly interpolate the new reality. This long and curious history has left its trace on almost every part of our present political condition. Its effects lie at the root of many of our most important controversies, and because these effects are not rightly perceived, many of these controversies are misconceived. One of the most curious peculiarities of the English people is its dislike of the executive government. We are not in this respect un vrai pupil moderne, like the Americans. The Americans conceive of the executive as one of their appointed agents. When it intervenes in common life, it does so, they consider, in virtue of the mandate of the sovereign people, and there is no invasion or dereliction of freedom in that people interfering with itself. The French, the Swiss, and all nations who breathe the full atmosphere of the 19th century think so too. The material necessities of this age require a strong executive. A nation destitute of it cannot be clean or healthy or vigorous like a nation possessing it. By definition, a nation calling itself free should have no jealousy of the executive, for freedom means that the nation, the political part of the nation, wields the executive. But our history has reversed the English feeling. Our freedom is the result of centuries of resistance, more or less legal, or more or less illegal, more or less audacious, or more or less timid to the executive government. We have, accordingly, inherited the traditions of conflict and preserved them in the fullness of victory. We look on state action, not as our own action, but as alien action, as an imposed tyranny from without, not as the consummated result of our own organized wishes. I remember at the census of 1851 hearing a very sensible old lady say that the liberties of England were at an end. If government might be thus inquisitorial, if they might ask who slept in your house, or what your age was, what, she argued, might they not ask, and what might they not do? The natural impulse of the English people is to resist authority. The introduction of effectual policemen was not liked. I know people, old people, I admit, who to this day consider them an infringement of freedom and an imitation of the gendarmes of France. If the original policemen had been started with the present helmets, the result might have been dubious. There might have been a cry of military tyranny, and the inbred insubordination of the English people might have prevailed over the very modern love of perfect peace and order. The old notion that the government is an extrinsic agency still rules our imaginations, though it is no longer true, and though in calm and intellectual moments we well know it is not. Nor is it merely our history which produces this effect. We might get over that, but the results of that history cooperate. Our double government so acts. When we want to point the antipathy to the executive, we refer to the jealousy of the crown, so deeply embedded in the very substance of constitutional authority. So many people are loth to admit the Queen, in spite of law and fact, to be the people's appointee and agent, that it is a good rhetorical emphasis to speak of her prerogative as something non-popular, and therefore to be distrusted. By the very nature of our government, our executive cannot be liked and trusted, as the Swiss or the American is liked and trusted. Out of the same history and the same results proceed our tolerance of those local authorities, which so puzzle many foreigners. In the struggle with the crown, these local centers served as props and fulcrums. In the early parliaments, it was the local bodies who sent members to parliament, the counties, and the boroughs, and in that way, and because of their free life, the parliament was free too. If active real bodies had not sent the representatives, they would have been powerless. This is very much the reason why our old rights of suffrage were so various. The government let whatever people happened to be the strongest in each town choose the members. They applied to the electing bodies the test of natural selection. Whatever set of people were locally strong enough to elect did so. Afterwards, in the Civil War, many of the corporations, like that of London, were important bases of resistance. The case of London is typical and remarkable. Probably, if there is any body more than another which an educated Englishman nowadays regards with little favor, it is the Corporation of London. He connects it with hereditary abuses perfectly preserved, with large revenues imperfectly accounted for, with a system which stops the principal city government at an old archway, with the perpetuation of 100 detestable parishes, with the maintenance of a horde of luxurious and useless bodies. For the want of all which makes Paris nice and splendid, we justly reproach the Corporation of London. For the existence of much of what makes London mean and squalid, we justly reproach it too. Yet the Corporation of London was for centuries a bulwark of English liberty. The conscious support of the near and organized capital gave the Long Parliament a vigor and vitality which they could have found nowhere else. Their leading patriots took refuge in the city, and the nearest approach to an English sitting in permanence is the committee at Guildhall, where all members that came were to have voices. Down to George Roman III's time, the city was a useful center of popular judgment. Here, as elsewhere, we have built into our polity pieces of the scaffolding by which it was erected. De Tocqueville indeed used to maintain that in this matter the English were not merely historically excusable, but likewise politically judicious. He founded what may be called the cult of corporations. And it was natural that in France, where there is scarcely any power of self-organization in the people, where the prophet must be asked upon every subject, and take the initiative in every movement, a solitary thinker should be repelled from the exaggerations of which he knew the evil to the contrary exaggeration of which he did not. But in a country like England, where business is in the air, where we can organize a vigilance committee on every abuse and an executive committee for every remedy as a matter of political instruction, which was de Tocqueville's point, we need not care how much power is delegated to outlying bodies and how much is kept for the central body. We have had the instruction municipalities could give us. We have been through all that. Now we are quite grown up and can put away childish things. The same causes account for the innumerable anomalies of our polity. I own that I do not entirely sympathize with the horror of these anomalies, which haunt some of our best critics. It is natural that those who by special and admirable culture have come to look at all things upon the artistic side should start back from these queer peculiarities. But it is natural also that persons used to analyze political institutions should look at these anomalies with a little tenderness and a little interest. They may have something to teach us. Political philosophy is still more imperfect. It has been framed from observations taken upon regular specimens of politics and states. As to these, its teaching is most valuable. But we must ever remember that its data are imperfect. The lessons are good where its primitive assumptions hold, but may be false where those assumptions fail. A philosophical politician regards a political anomaly as a scientific physician regards a rare disease. It is to him an interesting case. There may still be instruction here, though we have worked out the lessons of common cases. I cannot, therefore, join in the full cry against anomalies. In my judgment, it may quickly overrun the scent, and so miss what we should be glad to find. Subject to this saving remark, however, I not only admit, but maintain, that our Constitution is full of curious oddities, which are impeding and mischievous, and ought to be struck out. Our law very often reminds one of those outskirts of cities where you cannot for a long time tell how the streets come to wind about in so capricious and serpent-like a manner. At last it strikes you that they grew up, house by house, on the devious tracks of the old green lanes, and if you follow on to the existing fields, you may often find the change half complete. Just so the lines of our Constitution were framed in old eras of sparse population, few wants, and simple habits, and we adhere in seeming to their shape, though civilization has come with its dangers, complications, and enjoyments. These anomalies, in 100 instances, mark the old boundaries of a constitutional struggle. The casual line was traced according to the strength of deceased combatants. Succeeding generations fought elsewhere, and the hesitating line of a half-drawn battle was left to stand for a perpetual limit. I do not count as an anomaly the existence of our double government, with all its infinite accidents, though half the superficial peculiarities that are often complained of arise out of it. The coexistence of a Queen's seeming prerogative and a Downing Street's real government is just suited to such a country as this, in such an age as ours. So well is our real government concealed that if you tell a cabman to drive to Downing Street, he most likely will never have heard of it and will not in the least know where to take you. It is only a disguised republic. End of project. Gutenberg's The English Constitution by Walter Bagehot.